The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace gardens as Prince Alexander stood by the window, his fingers tracing patterns on the frosted glass. Beside him, Princess Isabella adjusted the simple blue ribbon in her hair, a stark contrast to the elaborate jewels that usually adorned her. Today would be different. Today, they would step away from protocol and into the hearts of their people. The kingdom of Luminara had been shaken by tragedy. A terrible flood had swept through the northern villages just 3 weeks ago, leaving hundreds homeless and dozens of families mourning their lost loved ones. The royal couple had visited officially, of course. They had toured the damage, spoken with officials, and promised aid. But something had haunted Alexander since that day. The look in a young mother's eyes as she clutched her surviving child, standing where her home once stood. "Are you certain about this?" Isabella whispered, though her eyes showed she already knew the answer. They had discussed this late into the night, away from advisors and protocols. Alexander turned to face his wife, taking her hands in his. "When have we ever been more certain of anything?" Their plan was simple yet unprecedented. No cameras, no announcements, no royal guard visible. Just two people who happened to wear crowns, reaching out to those who needed to know they weren't forgotten. Isabella picked up the old leather satchel from the table. Inside were handwritten letters, dozens of them, each one penned personally by either her or Alexander over the past 2 weeks. No royal seal, no official letterhead, just words from one human being to another, acknowledging pain, offering hope, and sharing memories. "The car is ready, Your Highnesses." Thomas, their most trusted aide, appeared at the door. He was one of only 3 people who knew about today's journey. As they walked through the palace corridors, servants bowed and curtsied as usual, unaware that today their monarchs would do something that would change how a nation saw its royal family forever. The drive north took 3 hours. Alexander drove himself, another break from protocol, while Isabella studied her notebook. She had memorized every name, every story they had gathered. Mrs. Elena Morrison, who lost her husband while he was trying to save neighbors. Young Jamie Chen, 8 years old, who hadn't spoken since the night the waters came. The Patel family, who opened their small remaining shelter to house 15 strangers. "Do you remember what your mother used to say?" Isabella asked softly as they passed through the countryside. Alexander smiled, a sad but warm expression. That crowns are heavy not because of their gold, but because of the hearts they must carry. His mother, the late Queen Beatrice, had been beloved for her compassion, but even she had been bound by centuries of tradition and protocol. Today, her son would honor her memory by breaking those very chains. As they entered the outskirts of Northbrook, the most affected town, the devastation was still visible. Mud lines on buildings showed where the water had reached. Empty lots marked where homes once stood. But there were also signs of resilience, new temporary shelters, children playing in cleared areas, neighbors helping neighbors rebuild. They parked the unmarked car near the community center. Isabella pulled her simple coat tighter, hiding the royal insignia on her dress. Alexander wore plain clothes, looking like any other volunteer who had come to help. Their first stop was not planned. As they walked toward the center, they saw an elderly man sitting on rubble that was once his porch, staring at nothing. Without hesitation, Alexander walked over and sat beside him. No words at first, just presence. Isabella watched as her husband picked up a piece of broken ceramic, part of what might have been a plate or cup. The old man glanced at him, then at the shard. "My wife painted that," the man said quietly. 43 years we ate breakfast on those plates." Alexander nodded. Still holding the piece carefully, "Tell me about her." For the next 20 minutes, Harold Patterson talked about his late wife, Marie, who had passed just 6 months before the flood. how the last thing he had of her, their home and all its memories, had been washed away in minutes. Alexander listened, truly listened, occasionally sharing his own grief about losing his mother. Isabella, meanwhile, had been drawn to a group of children playing with worn toys near the shelter. She sat on the ground with them, her expensive coat getting muddy, and began folding paper flowers from sheets in her satchel. Soon she was teaching them the skill, and their laughter drew other children. Neither announced who they were. They were simply Alex and Bella to anyone who asked. As the morning progressed, they moved through the community with purpose, but without fanfare. At the temporary medical station, Isabella held babies while exhausted mothers rested. She sang soft lullabies, the same ones she sang to her own children. Alexander helped unload supply trucks, his hands working alongside laborers and volunteers. It was near noon when they reached the community center proper. Inside, families were gathered for a communal meal, the daily gathering that had become both necessity and comfort for the displaced. The cook, a robust woman named Mary, was ladling soup with tired movements. "Let me," Isabella said simply, taking the ladle. For the next hour, the Princess of Luminara served soup to her people, looking each person in the eye, exchanging small words of comfort and solidarity. Alexander moved through the tables, sitting with different families, listening to their stories. He had a gift for making people feel heard, and today he used it not as a prince, but as a fellow human being who understood that sometimes the greatest gift is simply being seen. At one table sat the Chen family. Young Jamie, the boy who hadn't spoken since the flood, clutched a worn teddy bear. Alexander sat across from him, not forcing conversation, but simply being present. He pulled out a small wooden whistle from his pocket, something he had carved himself during the long nights of planning this visit. He didn't offer it to Jamie immediately. Instead, he began to play a simple tune, one his mother had taught him. The melody was soft, haunting, and somehow hopeful. The room gradually quieted as people listened. When he finished, he placed the whistle on the table between them. Jamie looked at it, then at Alexander, and for the first time in 3 weeks, the boy's lips moved. No words came, but he picked up the whistle. Isabella, still serving soup, caught this moment and felt tears prick her eyes. This was why they had come. Not for grand gestures or official proclamations, but for these small human connections. As the afternoon wore on, they continued their quiet ministry. They helped clean dishes, played with children, and sat with the grieving. Each handwritten letter from their satchel was delivered personally, slipped into hands with whispered words of encouragement. One such letter went to Elena Morrison, the widow. Isabella found her sitting alone in the corner, knitting with mechanical movements. The princess sat beside her, admiring the work. "I have something for you," Isabella said softly, pulling out the envelope. It's from someone who understands loss." Elena opened it slowly. The letter, in Isabella's own hand, spoke of losing her father when she was young, of the emptiness that follows when someone who filled your world is suddenly gone. It spoke of how grief is love with nowhere to go, and how that love still matters, still shapes the world. As Elena read, tears began to fall. Isabella simply sat with her, occasionally touching her shoulder, letting her grieve without shame or hurry. By late afternoon, word had somehow spread through the community that something special was happening, though no one quite knew what. The royal couple had been so natural, so present, that recognition came slowly. A mother who had seen Isabella at an official event months ago was the first to wonder. A young man who had served in the military recognized Alexander's bearing despite his simple clothes. But instead of creating distance, this gradual recognition seemed to deepen the connection. Their prince and princess had come not for cameras or politics, but simply to be with them in their pain. The sun was beginning its descent when Alexander noticed a small crowd gathering near the makeshift memorial at the town square. Flowers, photographs, and handwritten messages covered a temporary wall, tributes to those lost in the flood. He and Isabella exchanged glances and moved toward it together. Among those gathered was Sarah Coleman, a teacher who had lost 5 of her students. She stood with their parents, a small group united by unbearable loss. They were preparing for an impromptu remembrance, something they did each evening since the tragedy. Without announcement or ceremony, Alexander and Isabella joined the circle. Sarah's voice trembled as she began to speak about each child, their dreams, their laughter, their favorite subjects. When she reached Tommy Williams, a boy who loved astronomy, her voice broke entirely. Alexander stepped forward then, his own voice quiet but clear. "May I?" he asked Sarah, who nodded through her tears. He spoke of Tommy, though he had never met him. He spoke of every child who looks at the stars with wonder, of every dream cut short, of how the universe itself grieves when such lights are extinguished. His words were not those of a prince making a speech, but of a father who understood that every lost child leaves a void that echoes through eternity. Isabella began to hum softly, a melody that seemed to rise from somewhere deep within. It was an old lullaby from Luminara's past, one that every mother knew, one that had comforted children for generations. One by one, others joined in, their voices creating a harmony that seemed to wrap around the grieving parents like an embrace. As the last notes faded, something remarkable happened. Mrs. Chen, Jamie's mother, approached Isabella with trembling hands. "Your Highness," she whispered, the recognition now clear in her eyes. "You served us soup. You sat in the mud with our children." The crowd's murmur grew as understanding rippled through them. Their prince and princess had been among them all day, not as royalty, but as neighbors, as friends, as fellow souls who understood suffering. An elderly woman pushed forward then, her weathered hands clutching a small bundle. It was Anna Volkov, who had lived through 3 floods in her 80 years and lost everything each time. This time, she had lost her grandson too. "I have nothing left to give," Anna said, her voice carrying the weight of her years. "But my mother taught me that when someone shares your burden, you must share what little you have." She unwrapped the bundle, revealing a small hand-embroidered handkerchief, the last thing she had saved from her grandmother. She pressed it into Isabella's hands. The princess looked at the delicate work, understanding the magnitude of this gift. Tears flowed freely down her cheeks as she embraced the old woman. "No," Isabella whispered, "this stays with you. But let me add to its story." She pulled from her pocket a small golden locket, not crown jewels, but her personal possession, containing pictures of her own children. She opened it to show Anna, then gently placed it in the old woman's palm. "So you remember that love transcends all losses." This exchange, witnessed by dozens, seemed to break something open in the gathering. The formal distance that had always existed between crown and subject melted away entirely. People began to share, not just their grief, but their strength, their hope, their determination to rebuild. Marcus Webb, a fisherman who had lost his boat and livelihood, spoke up. "I thought you had forgotten us," he said to Alexander, his voice rough with emotion. "After the cameras left, after the officials made their promises and disappeared, I thought we were alone." Alexander met his gaze steadily. "Forgive us," he said simply, "for taking so long to understand that showing up isn't about ceremonies. It's about this." He gestured to the circle of people, to the shared tears and held hands. As darkness began to fall, candles appeared. Where they came from, no one could later say, but suddenly everyone held one. The memorial wall flickered in the dancing light as people added new messages, new flowers, new tributes. Isabella and Alexander moved through the crowd, lighting candles from their own, creating a chain of light that spread through the square. With each flame passed, they whispered names, not titles or formal addresses, but first names, nicknames, the intimate identifiers that said, "I see you, I know you, you matter." Young Jamie Chen, still clutching the wooden whistle Alexander had given him, stood with his parents. As the prince lit their candle, the boy looked up at him and spoke his first words since the flood. "Thank you." They were barely audible, but they rang through the square like bells. The vigil continued as stars appeared overhead. People shared stories not just of loss, but of survival. The Patel family spoke of the strangers who had become family in their small shelter. Neighbors testified about heroism they had witnessed. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things when the waters rose. Through it all, Alexander and Isabella remained. They held crying children, embraced grieving spouses, and stood witness to pain that protocol usually kept at a safe distance. Their expensive clothes were stained with mud and tears, their faces etched with the exhaustion of genuine emotional labor. As the vigil wound down, Thomas appeared at the edge of the square. He had been watching all day, ensuring their safety from a distance, and now he carried urgent news. He caught Alexander's eye and tapped his watch, a signal that couldn't be ignored. The prince understood. They had pushed protocol as far as it could bend. Soon, palace security would arrive, the media would discover their location, and the moment would be lost to spectacle. But Isabella had one more act to complete. She climbed onto the small platform near the memorial, helping pull Alexander up beside her. The crowd quieted, expecting perhaps now the formal speech, the royal pronouncement they knew so well. Instead, Isabella began to remove her coat. Beneath it was her dress, simple but still bearing the royal insignia. She unpinned the insignia and held it up in the candlelight. "This symbol," she said, her voice carrying across the square, "has meant distance for too long. It has meant ceremonies and protocols and walls between us." She looked at Alexander, who nodded and removed his own royal pin. Together, they placed these symbols at the base of the memorial. "Let them rest here," Alexander said, "with your loved ones, and let us promise you this. The crown will no longer be just something we wear. It will be something we share. Your burdens are our burdens. Your hopes are our hopes. Your children are our children." The silence that followed was profound. Then, slowly, Anna Volkov began to clap. Others joined, but this was not the orchestrated applause of royal events. This was recognition, gratitude, and something deeper, acceptance. As they prepared to leave, people pressed forward not for autographs or photos, but for one last touch, one last word. Children gave them drawings. Mothers pressed preserved flowers into their hands. Fathers shook Alexander's hand with grip that conveyed what words couldn't. Elena Morrison, the widow who had received Isabella's letter, approached last. She held out a small wooden bird, something her husband had been carving when he died. "He was making this for our grandchild," she said, "but I think he would want you to have it. To remember that even in loss, we keep creating beauty." Isabella cradled the bird carefully, understanding that she held not just carved wood, but trust itself. As they finally made their way back to the car, the crowd parted respectfully, but as the vehicle pulled away, people didn't disperse. They stayed in the square, candles still burning, continuing to share stories and comfort. The royal couple had left, but what they had kindled remained. In the car, Isabella leaned against Alexander's shoulder, emotionally spent. They had given no money today. The official relief funds would handle that. They had made no grand promises or policy announcements. They had simply shown up as human beings, and somehow that had changed everything. Mother was wrong, Alexander said quietly, as they drove through the darkness. Crowns aren't heavy because of the hearts they must carry. They're heavy when we forget that carrying hearts is all that really matters. Through the rear window, they could still see the glow of candles in the town square, a constellation of lights held by people who now knew their pain was seen, their loss acknowledged, their humanity shared by those who wore crowns. The next morning dawned quiet in the palace, but across the kingdom of Luminara, something unprecedented was happening. Margaret Sullivan, a janitor at Northbrook Community Center, had spent the night unable to sleep. She kept replaying the moment when she realized the woman who had helped her clean tables was Princess Isabella. On impulse, she took out her phone and typed a simple message on social media. Yesterday, our princess sat on our muddy floor and folded paper flowers with our children. Our prince carried our burdens, literally. No cameras, no announcement. They just came to be with us. I don't have words for what this means. She attached a single photo she had taken unknowingly, Isabella kneeling beside a child, both focused on creating something beautiful from simple paper. The image was blurry, candid, and more powerful than any official portrait. Within hours, Margaret's post had been shared thousands of times. But it wasn't alone. Others from Northbrook began adding their stories. Marcus Webb wrote about Alexander helping him understand that losing his boat didn't mean losing his identity as a provider. Sarah Coleman shared how the prince's words at the memorial had given her permission to grieve her students openly. The Chen family posted a video of Jamie playing his wooden whistle, the first music their home had heard since the flood. The caption read simply, "Our prince gave our son his voice back." By midday, news outlets had picked up the story, but found themselves in an unusual position. There was no official palace statement to quote, no staged photographs to display. Only the raw, unfiltered testimonies of citizens who had experienced something extraordinary. At the palace, Alexander and Isabella woke to find Thomas waiting with an expression of barely contained concern. "Your Highnesses," he began carefully, "the nation knows." They followed him to the media room, where every screen showed different aspects of their visit. News anchors struggled to maintain professional composure as they read accounts from Northbrook. One veteran journalist, known for his cynicism, had tears in his eyes as he described the wooden bird Elena Morrison had given to the princess. "In 20 years of covering the royal family," he said, voice wavering, "I have never seen anything like this. This wasn't publicity. This was humanity." The palace communications team was in crisis. Protocol demanded a statement, an explanation, some form of control over the narrative. But Alexander raised his hand for silence. "No statements," he said firmly. "What happened yesterday doesn't need our interpretation. It speaks for itself." As the day progressed, something unexpected began happening across Luminara. In the capital, a wealthy businessman closed his office and drove to a local shelter where he spent the afternoon serving meals. A group of teenagers in the southern provinces organized a candlelight vigil for flood victims they had never met. Neighbors who had lived side by side for years without speaking found themselves sharing coffee and conversation. The royal insignias that Alexander and Isabella had left at the memorial became an impromptu pilgrimage site. People traveled from across the kingdom not to take them, but to leave their own offerings. Flowers for lost loved ones, letters of gratitude, symbols of their own positions and privileges they wanted to transform into service. In the Parliament, heated debates about flood relief funding came to an abrupt halt when Minister Catherine Wells stood and read Jamie Chen's story aloud. "If an 8-year-old boy can find his voice after such trauma because someone simply sat with him," she said, "then surely we can find ours to do what's right." The relief package passed unanimously, the first unanimous vote in Luminara's modern history. But perhaps the most moving responses came from unexpected places. In a maximum security prison, inmates organized a workshop to create wooden toys for children who had lost everything in the flood. The prison director later reported that hardened criminals wept as they carved and painted, saying they finally had a way to give something back. Elderly residents in care homes across the kingdom began knitting blankets and scarves for flood victims. Children in schools that had never been affected by disaster started writing letters to their peers in Northbrook, creating bonds that would last lifetimes. 3 days after the visit, Alexander and Isabella made their first public appearance at a pre-scheduled state dinner for foreign dignitaries. They wore their full regalia, crowns gleaming under crystal chandeliers. But something had changed. As they entered the ballroom, the assembled guests, ambassadors, nobles, and officials who had seen countless royal entrances stood not out of protocol, but out of genuine respect. The Danish ambassador, known for his reserved demeanor, approached Isabella with tears in his eyes. "Your Highness," he said, "my grandson asked me yesterday why our royal family doesn't love people the way you do. I had no answer." During the dinner, conversation repeatedly returned to the flood response. Foreign dignitaries wanted to know how they could implement similar approaches in their nations. The formal state dinner transformed into a workshop on compassionate governance, with Alexander and Isabella sharing not policies, but principles. "We didn't go to Northbrook with a plan," Isabella admitted to the assembled guests. "We went with broken hearts and a conviction that protocol should never stand between human beings in pain." As weeks passed, the impact continued to ripple outward. Applications for volunteer positions at charitable organizations increased by 400%. Anonymous donations to flood relief funds reached unprecedented levels. But more than money or volunteerism, there was a shift in how people saw each other. In Northbrook, the community that had been brought together by tragedy found itself bound by something stronger. The evening gatherings in the town square continued. But now they included not just grief, but celebration. Jamie Chen, growing more confident with his whistle each day, became the unofficial musician of these gatherings. Elena Morrison started a support group for widows that grew to include women from surrounding towns. The wooden bird she had given to Isabella was displayed in a special case in the palace's public gallery, alongside a simple placard. A reminder that in loss, we keep creating beauty. Gift from Elena Morrison of Northbrook. It became the most visited item in the palace, with people often leaving their own small wooden carvings beside the case. 6 months later, on the anniversary of the flood, something remarkable happened. Without any official organization, people across Luminara lit candles at sunset. From the palace balcony, Alexander and Isabella watched as their kingdom transformed into a sea of lights, each one representing a promise to see each other, to show up for each other, to remember that crowns and titles matter less than shared humanity. Jamie Chen, now speaking freely though still quiet, had been invited to the palace for the anniversary. He stood between the royal couple on the balcony, his wooden whistle in hand. As the sun set, he began to play, the same melody Alexander had taught him, but now filled with his own variations, his own voice. The song carried across the silent capital, broadcasted across the nation. When he finished, the silence held for a moment before candles began swaying in unison, millions of lights moving as one, a kingdom united not by decree, but by choice. Isabella felt Alexander's hand find hers as they watched their people. Below them, in the palace courtyard, their own children stood with castle staff, all holding candles together. The hierarchy that had defined royal life for centuries seemed to dissolve in the dancing light. "Look what a wooden whistle started," Alexander murmured. "No," Isabella corrected gently, watching Jamie smile shyly at the crowd below. "Look what happens when we remember that inside every crown, every title, every role, there's just a person who needs to know they're not alone." As the vigil continued into the night, stories emerged from every corner of Luminara. A executive had reconciled with his estranged brother after realizing that pride mattered less than presence. A teacher had started visiting elderly neighbors, inspired by how Alexander sat with Harold Patterson. Children who had never experienced loss themselves raised funds for flood victims through handmade crafts. The foreign media struggled to categorize what had happened. It wasn't a revolution or a reform. There had been no declarations or new laws. A prince and princess had simply spent a day being human, and somehow that had reminded an entire nation of its own humanity. Years later, historians would mark that quiet visit to Northbrook as a turning point in Luminara's history, not because of any policy that emerged from it, but because it redefined what leadership meant. Other nations would study the Luminara model, trying to understand how a single day of genuine presence could transform a kingdom. But for the people who lived through it, the explanation was simpler. In their darkest hour, when they felt most alone, their leaders had come not to lead, but to stand beside them. They had shared soup and tears, stories and silence. They had shown that the greatest power of any crown is not in commanding, but in connecting. And so the kingdom of Luminara became known not for its wealth or might, but for something far more precious, a place where no one grieved alone, where leadership meant service, and where a simple wooden whistle could remind a nation that every voice matters. In the years that followed, whenever tragedy struck anywhere in the kingdom, the same phenomenon would occur. Without summons or organization, people would simply show up. They would serve soup, fold paper flowers, listen to stories, and light candles. They had learned from their prince and princess that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply be present for another human being's pain. And always, somewhere in these gatherings, someone would play a wooden whistle, the melody now known throughout Luminara as the Song of Shared Hearts, a reminder that on one ordinary day, a kingdom discovered that love is the only crown that matters.